But what, while hope was springing high in America, was taking place in France? So far as the world could say, there was little, if anything, to disturb the Confederates. And yet on the horizon a cloud the size of a man's hand had appeared. M. Armand had turned to another member of the Legislative Assembly, a sound Bonapartist like himself, Mr. Vorez of Nantes, to whom he had sublet a part of the Confederate contract. The truth about the ships and their destination thus became part of the archives of the Vorez firm. No phase of Napoleonic intrigue could go very far without encountering dishonesty, and to the confidential clerk of M. Vorez there occurred the bright idea of doing something for himself with this valuable diplomatic information. One fine day the clerk was missing, and with him certain papers. Then there ensued a period of months during which the firm and their employers could only conjecture the full extent of their loss. In reality, from the Confederate point of view, everything was lost. Again, the episode becomes too complex to be followed in detail. Suffice it to say that the papers were sold to the United States, that the secret was exposed, that the United States made a determined assault upon the imperial government. In the midst of this entanglement, Slidell lost his head, for hope deferred when apparently within reach of its end is a dangerous counsel of state. In his extreme anxiety, Slidell sent to the Emperor a note, the blunt rashness of which the writer could not have appreciated, saying that he feared the Emperor's subordinates might play into the hands of Washington. He threw his fat in the fire by speaking of the ships as now being constructed at Bordeaux and Nantes for the government of the Confederate States, and virtually claimed of Napoleon a promise to let them go to sea. 3 days later, the Minister of Foreign Affairs took him sharply to task because of this note, reminding him that what had passed with the Emperor was confidential, and dropping the significant hint that France could not be forced into war by indirection. According to Slidell's version of the interview, the minister's tone changed completely when Slidell replied with a detailed history of the affair, showing that the idea originated with the Emperor. Perhaps the minister knew more than he chose to betray. From this hour the game was up. Napoleon's purpose all along seemed to have been quite plain. He meant to help the South to win by itself, and after it had won, to use it for his own advantage. So precarious was his position in Europe that he did not dare risk an American war without England's aid, and England had cast the die. In this way, secrecy was the condition necessary to continue building of the ships. Now that the secret was out, Napoleon began to shift his ground. He sounded the Washington government and found it suspiciously equivocal as to Mexico. To silence the French Republicans, to whom the American minister had supplied information about the ships, Napoleon tried at first muzzling the press, but as late as February 1864 he was still carrying water on both shoulders. His minister of marine notified the builders that they must get the ships out of France unarmed under fictitious sail to some neutral country. The next month, reports which the Confederate commissioners sent home became distinctly alarmed. Man wrote from Brussels, "Napoleon has enjoined upon Maximilian to hold no official relations with our commissioners in Mexico." Shortly after this, Slidell received a shock that was the beginning of the end. Maximilian, on passing through Paris on his way to Mexico, refused to receive him. The Mexican project was now being condemned by all classes in France. Nevertheless, the government was trying to float a Mexican loan, and it is hardly fanciful to think that on this loan the last hope of the Confederacy turned. Despite the popular attitude toward Mexico, the loan was going well when the House of Representatives of the United States dealt the Confederacy a staggering blow. It passed unanimous resolutions in the most grim terms denouncing the substitution of monarchical for republican government in Mexico under European auspices. When this action was reported in France, the Mexican loan collapsed. Napoleon's Italian policy was now moving rapidly toward the crisis which it reached during the following summer when he surrendered to the opposition and promised to withdraw the French troops from Rome. In May, when the loan collapsed, there was nothing for it but to throw over his dear friends of the Confederacy. Presently he had summoned Armand before him, rated him severely, and ordered him to make bona fide sales of the ships to neutral powers. The Minister of Marine professed surprise and indignation at Armand's trifling with the neutrality of the imperial government, and that particularly was the end of the episode. Equally complete was the breakdown of the Confederate negotiations with Mexico. General Preston was refused recognition. In those fierce days of July, when the fate of Atlanta was in the balance, the pride and despair of the Confederate government flared up in a haughty letter to Preston, reminding him that it had never been the intention of this government to offer any agreement to the new government of Mexico, nor to place itself in any attitude other than that of complete equality, and directing him to make no further overtures to the Mexican emperor. And then came the debacle in Georgia. On that same 20th of September, when Benjamin poured out in a letter to Slidell his stored-up bitterness denouncing Napoleon, Davis, feeling the last crisis was up on him, left Richmond to join the army in Georgia. His frame of mind he had already expressed when he said, "We have no friends abroad." The loss of Atlanta was the signal for another conflict of authority within the Confederacy. Georgia was now in the condition in which Alabama had found itself in the previous year. A great mobile army of invaders lay encamped on her soil, and yet there was still a state government established at the capital. Inevitably, the man who thought of the situation from the point of view of what we should now call the General Staff, and the man who thought of it from the point of view of the citizens of the invading state, suffered each an intensification of feeling and each became determined to solve the problem in his own way. The President of the Confederacy and the Governor of Georgia represented these incompatible points of view. The Governor, Joseph E. Brown, is one of the puzzling figures of Confederate history. We have already encountered him as a dogged opponent of the administration. With the whole fabric of Southern life toppling about his ears, Brown argued, quibbled, evaded, and became a rallying point of dissatisfaction. That more eminent Georgian, Hal Cobb, applied to him very severe language, and they became engaged in a controversy over that provision of the Conscription Act which exempted state officials from military service. While the governor of Virginia was refusing certificates of exemption to the minor civil officers such as Justice of the Peace, Brown by proclamation promised his protection to the most insignificant civil servants. "Will even your Excellency," demanded Cobb, "certify that in any county of Georgia 20 justices of the peace and an equal number of constables are necessary for the proper administration of the state government?" The Bureau of Conscription estimated that Brown kept out of the Army approximately 8,000 eligible men. The truth seemed to be that neither by education nor heredity was this governor equipped to conceive large ideas. He never seemed conscious of the war as a whole, or of the Confederacy as a whole. To defend Georgia, and if that could not be done, to make peace for Georgia, such in the mind of Brown was the aim of the war. His restless jealousy of the administration finds its explanation in his fear that it would denude his state of men. The seriousness of Governor Brown's opposition became apparent within a week of the fall of Atlanta. Among Hood's forces were some 10,000 Georgia militia. Brown notified Hood that these troops had been called out solely with a view to the defense of Atlanta, that since Atlanta had been lost, they must now be permitted to return to their homes and look for a time after important interest, and that therefore he did withdraw said organizations from Hood's command. In other words, Brown was afraid that they might be taken out of the state. By proclamation he therefore gave the militia a furlough of 30 days. Previous to the issue of this proclamation, Seddon had written to Brown, making requisition for his 10,000 militia to assist in a pending campaign against Sherman. 2 days after his proclamation had appeared, Brown, in a voluminous letter full of blistering rhetoric and abounding in sneers at the President, demanded immediate reinforcements by order of the President and threatened that, if they were not sent, he would recall the Georgia troops from the army of Lee and would command all the sons of Georgia to return to their own state and within their own limits to rally round her glorious flag. So threatening was the situation in Georgia that Davis attempted to take it into his own hands. In a grim frame of mind, he left Richmond for the front. The resulting military arrangements do not, of course, belong strictly to the subject matter of this volume, but the brief tour of speechmaking which Davis made in Georgia and the interior of South Carolina must be noticed, for his purpose seems to have been to put the military point of view squarely before the people. He meant them to see how the soldiers looked at the situation, ignoring all demands of locality, of affiliation, of hardship, and considering only how to meet and beat the enemy. In his tense mood, he was not always fortunate in his expressions. At Augusta, for example, he described Beauregard, whom he had recently placed in general command over Georgia and South Carolina, as one who would do whatever the President told him to do. But this idea of military self-effacement was not happily worded, and the enemies of Davis seized on his phraseology as further evidence of his instinctive atrocity. The Mercury compared him to the Emperor of Russia and declared the tactless remark to be as insulting to General Beauregard as it is false and presumptuous in the President.